The wind had teeth in the winter of 1876, and it had been chewing on Eli's shepherd for the better part of 3 weeks. It gnawed at the seams of his sheepskin coat, worried the leather of his gloves, and laid a bitter frost on his beard. The mountains of Wyoming Territory were a hard anvil, and the winter was a harder hammer, and a man caught between them was liable to be beaten into a new and lesser shape. Eli was tired down to the bone, the kind of tired that got into a man's soul and made him wonder why he bothered drawing the next breath. He'd been to Cheyenne to sell what few head of cattle had survived the summer drought and the early snows, and the journey back had been a long, cold fight against a world that wanted him dead. His ranch was not much more than a cabin, a barn, and a few corrals huddled in a shallow basin, a tiny fistful of civilization shaken at the vast, uncaring wilderness. But it was his. The sight of the smoke curling thin and gray from his chimney should have been a comfort, a signal that his hearth was waiting. Instead, it was a threat. He had banked the fire himself before he left. No embers should have remained. He pulled the Winchester from its scabbard, the cold of the steel a familiar shock through his glove. He urged his weary horse forward. His eyes narrowed on the cabin. That was when he saw her. She stood on his porch as if she owned it, a woman framed by the raw timber and the gray sky. She was not young, but not old either. She was at that age where life had scraped away all softness, leaving behind only what was durable. A heavy wool shawl was wrapped around her head and shoulders, and a long, patched dress fell to the tops of worn leather boots. In the crook of her arm, she held a rifle. She did not aim it at him, but she held it with an ease that said she knew how. Her face was plain, all sharp angles and sun-weathered skin, but her eyes were what held him. They were the color of a stormy sky, and in their depths, he saw a grief so profound it had burned itself into a hard, defiant rage. Eli reined his horse to a stop 20 yards from the porch. The silence stretched, broken only by the keening wind and the tired snort of his horse. "You are trespassing," he said. His voice was a low rasp, rusty from disuse. The woman did not flinch. The door was unlocked. "That is an invitation to a coyote, not a neighbor. I have no neighbors." "I am aware," she said, her voice steady and clear, with a low timbre that carried on the wind. "My name is Helena. My husband was John Miller. He was prospecting up in the Black Hills." The name meant nothing to Eli. He waited. "He is dead now," she said, the words flat, stripped of all but the fact. "Bandits on the trail back. They took our wagon, our mules, everything. I walked from Willow Creek." Willow Creek was a good 2 days' walk, and that was in fair weather. Eli looked at her worn boots, at the lines of exhaustion etched around her eyes. He could see the truth of it. "I am not running a charity," he said, his voice hard. It was a necessary hardness, a shell grown over years of solitude. "I am not asking for it," she shot back, a flicker of fire in her gaze. "I need shelter for the night, just until the weather breaks. I have money, not much, but I can pay for a meal and a roof." Eli's eyes moved from her face to the rifle she held, then back again. He saw the story there, the one she was not telling, the story of a woman who had seen her man killed, who had been left with nothing but a weapon and a will to survive. He saw the stubborn pride that would not let her beg, even now, when she was clearly at the end of her rope. He swung a leg over his saddle and dropped to the ground, his joints groaning in protest. "You can have the barn. There is hay in the loft. It is clean enough." He did not offer the cabin. A man alone learned to guard his space, and he was not about to let a strange, armed woman into his home. A flicker of something. Disappointment, maybe, or just weary resignation, crossed her face before she masked it. "The barn will do," she said. "Thank you." He grunted in response, leading his horse toward the corral. He did not look back, but he could feel her eyes on him, watchful and assessing. After he had tended to his horse, rubbing the animal down and giving it a measure of oats. He carried his saddle and rifle into the cabin. The warmth inside was a blessing. Someone had fed the fire. A pot of coffee sat on the stove, still warm. He poured himself a mug, the bitter heat chasing some of the chill from his bones. From the cabin's single window, he could see the barn. The light was fading, the world turning a deep, bruised purple. He watched as a lantern flickered to life inside, casting a pale, trembling glow against the rough-hewn planks. He stood there for a long time, sipping his coffee, a sentinel at his own outpost. He did not trust her. Not yet. Trust was a currency he had long since run out of. Later, after he had eaten a lonely meal of beans and salted pork, he looked out the window again. The lantern in the barn was out. The moon had risen, a cold, silver dollar in the black sky, and it cast a stark light over the snow-covered yard. He could just make out a figure in the loft's opening, a silhouette against the darkness within. It was Helena. She thought she was alone, hidden by the night, but the moonlight caught the glint of metal in her hands. It was not the rifle. It was smaller, a revolver. She raised it, holding it in both hands. Her head bowed over it as if in prayer, and then her shoulders began to shake. He could not hear her, not from this distance, but he could see the silent, racking sobs that tore through her body. He watched as this proud, defiant woman fell apart in the freezing dark, clutching her dead husband's gun. The grief she had held at bay all day finally breaking free. Eli turned away from the window, a muscle tightening in his jaw. He felt like an intruder, a spy on a sorrow that was not his to witness. He stoked the fire, the crackle of the flames loud in the silent cabin. As he stared into the shifting embers, another image rose in his mind, unbidden. It was from a month ago, on his way to Cheyenne, a pillar of black smoke rising against a brilliant blue sky. As he drew closer, he saw the source, a wagon, burned down to its axles. The contents a charred, unrecognizable ruin. 2 mules lay dead in their harnesses. He had slowed his horse, his hand resting on his rifle. It had the look of a bandit raid. He'd scanned the surrounding hills, listening. There was nothing. No sound of survivors, no sign of the attackers. He had a choice then, to go down and investigate, to see if anyone needed help, or to keep moving. He was on open ground, a perfect target. He had money on him, and a long way to go. Getting involved was a fool's game. He had turned his horse and ridden on, leaving the smoking wreck behind him. He had not looked back. He closed his eyes now, the memory sharp and unwelcome. A prospector's wagon. Willow Creek. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that the burning wagon he had ridden past had been hers. He had left her there. He had left her alone with her dead husband and the ashes of her life. And he had not stopped. Miles away. And weeks before Eli's return, another soul was in flight. Clara Mae Thompson ran from the warmth of a wedding bed into the cold indifference of the night. She did not run like a woman seeking freedom. She ran like a criminal escaping the scene of the crime. Her fine silk wedding dress lay in a heap on the floor of her childhood room, a white ghost in the moonlight. In its place, she wore the drab gray woolen dress of a housemaid, a coarse garment that scratched at her skin and offered a desperately needed anonymity. Her father's house was a fortress of piety, every timber seemingly soaked in scripture and silent judgment. He was the Reverend Michael Thompson, a man whose love for God was matched only by his rigid conviction in his own righteousness. He had caught her halfway down the main staircase, a looming shadow in his nightshirt, a lamp held high. "Where do you think you are going, child?" His voice was not loud, but it had the chilling authority of a final verdict. "Away," she had whispered, clutching a small carpet bag filled with a few stolen dollars and a change of clothes. His eyes, chips of cold blue ice, had raked over her maid's disguise. He saw not a daughter in distress, but a soul in open rebellion, the man she had been married to that afternoon. A fellow preacher twice her age named Brother Abernathy was a good and holy man. In her father's eyes, this union was her last chance at salvation, a final opportunity to cleanse the stain of her past transgression. Her flight was not just a rejection of a man, it was a rejection of God's grace. "You are his wife now," her father had said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Your place is in his bed. You will go back upstairs and perform your duty." "I cannot," Clara had choked out, tears finally breaking free. "I will not." For a moment, he simply stared at her, his face a mask of cold fury. Then he stepped aside, gesturing with the lamp toward the front door. "Then go," he said, the words falling like stones into a well. "But know this, if you walk out that door, you are no longer a daughter of mine. You are cast out. You are disowned in the eyes of man and God. You will be alone." She had hesitated for a single, heart-stopping second. Then she had run, out the door and into the darkness, his words chasing her like hounds. She did not stop running until the lights of her town were a faint glimmer behind her. She made it to the stagecoach depot just as the early morning coach to Rawlins was preparing to leave. She paid her fare with trembling hands, keeping her face down, her borrowed shawl pulled tight. She was just another nameless woman heading west, a ghost leaving a life behind. The journey was a blur of dust and jolting discomfort. In Rawlins, a rough-and-tumble town teeming with railroad men and drifters, she felt an entirely new kind of fear. Here, her father's judgment meant nothing, but a woman alone was prey. She kept to the shadows, her eyes wide, every man's gaze feeling like a physical touch. It was on the wall of the sheriff's office that she saw the poster. It was old, the paper yellowed and torn at the edges, the ink faded by the sun, but the face was clear enough. A rough sketch of a man with hard eyes and a grim set to his jaw. The name read, Eli Shepherd, wanted $100 for involvement in a shootout in Laramie. The date on the poster was 5 years old. Clara stared at the face, her heart hammering against her ribs. She remembered that face. She remembered those eyes. It was from another time, another life. It seemed a cattle drive she had been on with her uncle, a night by a campfire, a group of rough men, their words like filth, and this man, Eli Shepherd, who had been working the drive, stepping out of the shadows. He had not said much, but his presence had been enough. There had been violence later, a misunderstanding, and he had been the one to take the blame, forced to ride out of town in disgrace. But she remembered the quiet way he had stood between her and them, a silent protector. He had been kind. Without thinking, her hand shot out. She ripped the poster from the wall, the paper tearing in her haste. She crumpled it into a ball, her breath coming in ragged gasps. It was a foolish, impulsive act. Someone might have seen, but she could not bear to see his face, the face of the only man who had ever shown her a moment of selfless decency, displayed for all the world as a common criminal. Shoving the crumpled paper into her pocket, she fled. She knew she could not stay in Rawlins. She needed to go further, deeper into the wilderness, to a place where no one knew her name or her shame. She saw a freight wagon being loaded with supplies, its canvas cover hiding its destination. The driver was inside the mercantile, his back to the street, in a moment of pure desperation. Clara scrambled into the back of the wagon, burrowing herself deep among sacks of flour and crates of tinned goods. As the wagon lurched into motion, heading west into the unknown, she curled into a tight ball and finally allowed the darkness to take her. Back at Eli's ranch, an uneasy truce had settled. Helena had proven to be as good as her word. She rose before he did, her silhouette moving in the pre-dawn gloom. And she worked until long after the sun had set. She mucked out the stalls, split firewood with a grim determination, and patched the corral fence with surprising skill. She asked for nothing, but he left a plate of food on the porch for her each evening. And in the morning, the plate was always returned, wiped clean. They spoke little, and when they did, their words were clipped and functional, like two strangers forced to share a small, confined space. "The axe is dull," she stated one afternoon, leaning the tool against the wood pile. "I will sharpen it," he replied, not looking up from the bridle he was mending. "The gray mare has a loose shoe." "I will see to it." He was gruff and blunt, his manner an impenetrable wall. She was proud and armed, her grief a shield that kept the world at bay. He found himself watching her as she worked, admiring her resilience against his will. She moved with an economy of motion, wasting no energy, her face set in a permanent mask of grim resolve. He wondered what she had been like before, what sort of woman her husband had known. One morning, she approached him as he was heading to the barn. "I have been here 3 days," she said, her arms crossed over her chest. "My keep has been earned. I will be on my way." Eli looked up at the sky. The clouds were low and heavy, the color of lead. The air was still and held a biting cold that promised more snow. "You will not make it to South Pass in this," he said. "A storm is coming." "I am not afraid of a storm." "Then you are a fool," he said flatly. "Stay, until it passes." She bristled at his tone, her stormy eyes flashing. "I told you, I do not take charity." "And I told you I am not offering any," he snapped back, his own patience wearing thin. "The roof on the lean-to needs patching. The work is there if you want it. Your choice." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the yard. He did not know if she would stay or go, and he told himself he did not care. But a few minutes later, he heard the sound of a hammer on the lean-to roof. He allowed himself a small, grim smile. The woman was as stubborn as a winter-starved mule, but she was no fool. The blizzard hit that afternoon, a white fury that descended from the mountains and swallowed the world. The wind screamed like a banshee, and the snow fell so thick and fast that Eli could not see the barn from his cabin window. He spent the day indoors, reinforcing the shutters and keeping the fire roaring. He thought of Helena, alone in the barn, and felt a pang of something he refused to name. As dusk began to fall, he realized he had not heard from the new calf, born just a week before. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through him. The calf's mother was a first-timer and prone to wandering. He pulled on his heaviest coat, grabbed a lantern, and stepped out into the maelstrom. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet. The snow was already knee-deep and drifting. He could see nothing, the world reduced to a swirling vortex of white. He shouted the cow's name, his voice swallowed by the storm. He was about to turn back when a second lantern appeared beside him, a small beacon in the chaos. It was Helena. "What are you doing?" she yelled over the wind. "The calf! It is missing!" She did not waste time with questions. She simply nodded, pulled her shawl tighter, and held her lantern high. "We will search together. You go toward the creek. I will check the ridge." For 2 hours, they fought their way through the blizzard. 2 small, flickering lights against an immense, raging darkness. Eli was beginning to lose hope when he heard a faint cry. A weak, bleating sound carried on a lull in the wind. He followed it to a deep snowdrift near the creek bed. The calf was trapped, shivering violently, half frozen. Its mother stood nearby, lowing pitifully, unable to reach it. It was too weak to walk. Eli scooped the small animal into his arms, its body a frigid weight against his chest. He turned back, and Helena was there, having seen his light change direction. Together, they battled their way back to the barn, the calf a fragile burden between them. Inside, the relative quiet was a relief. They laid the calf on a bed of fresh hay, and Helena began rubbing it vigorously with a dry sack, her movements brisk and efficient. Eli brought a bucket of warm milk from the mother, and they managed to get the calf to drink. Slowly, color returned to its gums, and its shivering subsided. They stood over the small creature, their breath pluming in the cold air of the barn. The storm raged outside, a wild beast trying to claw its way in. But inside this small pocket of warmth and life, there was a profound stillness. "You saved him," Eli said, his voice quiet. Helena just shook her head, still stroking the calf's back. "We saved him." They were both soaked through, their clothes stiff with ice. The cabin was 100 yards away, an impossible distance in the heart of the storm. "We will have to stay here," Eli said, "until it breaks." She nodded, not looking at him. "There is hay in the loft." They climbed up into the loft, the air thick with a sweet, dusty smell of dried grass. They made separate nests for themselves in the hay, a respectable distance apart. The only light came from the single lantern, casting long, dancing shadows. The only sound was the howling of the wind and the soft munching of the animals below. Eli lay back, the hay rustling beneath him. He was acutely aware of her presence, of the sound of her breathing just a few feet away. He had not shared a space with another person through the night in years. The feeling was strange, unsettling, and yet not entirely unwelcome. Nothing happened. Not a word was spoken. Not a touch exchanged. But as the long, dark hours passed, something shifted in the space between them. The rigid walls of distrust and solitude that they had both built around themselves began to develop a small, almost imperceptible crack. They were no longer just a man and a woman, strangers under a roof. They were two people who had faced the storm together and won. The blizzard raged for 2 days. When it finally blew itself out, it left behind a world transformed, a pristine, silent landscape buried under a thick blanket of white. The sun came out, dazzlingly bright on the new snow. It was on the 3rd day after the storm that Helena found the girl. She had been checking a line of traps near the edge of the property when she saw it. A disturbance in the snow. A long, deep trough that ended in a small, dark heap. Her first thought was that it was a wolf or a coyote that had succumbed to the cold. She approached cautiously, her rifle ready. It was a person, a young woman, half buried in a snowdrift, her face as white as the ground she lay on. She was dressed in rags, a thin, flimsy dress that offered no protection against the elements. A cascade of pale, blonde hair was matted with snow and ice. Helena knelt, pressing her fingers against the girl's neck. She felt a pulse, faint and thready. But there, she looked around. There were no tracks, save for the long, staggering line the girl had made before she collapsed. It was as if she had fallen from the sky. Helena's immediate reaction was one of suspicion. No one came to this place by accident. The girl was a thief, or a runaway, or something worse, but she could not leave her here to die. With a grunt of effort, she hoisted the girl into her arms. She was lighter than she looked, a bundle of sticks in a tattered dress. Eli was in the corral when he saw Helena struggling toward the cabin, carrying her strange burden. He ran to meet her. "What is this?" he demanded, looking down at the unconscious girl. "Found her by the North Ridge," Helena said, her voice strained with effort. "She is still alive. Just barely." Eli looked at the girl's face, at the delicate curve of her cheekbone and the pale blue tint of her lips. A jolt went through him, a shock of recognition so powerful it almost made him stagger. He knew this face. He knew this girl. He had not seen her in 5 years, but he had never forgotten her. Clara. Without a word, he gently took the girl from Helena's arms. He carried her inside the cabin and laid her on his own bed, close to the fire. Helena followed him in, her face a mask of disapproval. "You are bringing her in here?" she asked, her voice sharp. "She should be in the barn. She is likely a thief." Eli ignored her. He stripped off the girl's frozen, wet clothes with a detached efficiency, his hands surprisingly gentle. He wrapped her in a thick wool blanket and began rubbing her hands and feet, trying to force life back into them. Helena stood by the door, watching, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed. "You know her?" It was not a question. It was an accusation. Eli did not answer. He was focused on the girl, on the faint flicker of breath that misted in the cold air. He worked for an hour, forcing warm broth between her lips, piling more blankets on top of her. Finally, her eyelids fluttered. Pale blue eyes, hazy with confusion, stared up at him. She tried to speak, her voice a dry whisper. "Please." "You are safe," Eli said softly. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the rough log walls, the stone fireplace, and finally, the hard, unforgiving face of the woman standing by the door. Fear flared in her eyes. She tried to sit up, a desperate, panicked energy surging through her. "No, no, you cannot send me back," she pleaded, her voice gaining strength. "Please, I am begging you, do not send me back. He will find me." Helena took a step forward, her expression cold and contemptuous. "Who will find you, girl? Your husband, your father, the sheriff? You come here with nothing but lies in your mouth and trouble on your back." She looked from the girl's terrified face to Eli's grim, silent one. "She is a liar," Helena said, the word a judgment and a sentence. Clara's face crumpled, and she began to sob. Deep, hopeless sounds of utter despair. Eli stood, his broad frame a wall between the two women. He looked at Helena, his eyes dark and unreadable, and then he looked at the weeping girl on his bed, a ghost from a past he thought he had buried long ago. He said nothing. He did not have to. The truth was there, a silent, damning presence in the small, warm cabin. He remembered her. The cabin became a cage with 3 pacing animals, each wary of the other. Eli's word was law on his land, and his word was that Clara would stay in the house to recover. He moved his own things into the small tack room off the main cabin, a space that smelled of leather and oil, leaving his bed for the girl. It was a decision that settled a new and heavier silence over the ranch. Helena did not argue, but her disapproval was a physical presence in the room. She had wanted the girl in the barn. "A sick animal belongs in a stall," she had said, her voice flat and cold. "Not by the hearth." "She is not an animal," Eli had countered, his jaw tight. "And she will stay where I can watch her." He had framed it as a matter of security, a way to keep an eye on a stranger, but they all knew it was more than that. So Clara stayed, a pale ghost in Eli's bed, while Helena's resentment simmered like a pot left too long on the fire. The tension was a constant hum, a string pulled taut between the two women. When Clara was finally strong enough to leave the bed, she moved about the small cabin like a mouse, her footsteps light, her eyes always cast down, trying to make herself small enough to disappear. Helena saw only weakness. She saw the girl's soft, uncalloused hands, the fine texture of her hair, the way she startled at the slightest sound. To Helena, who had clawed her way back from the brink of death, this girl was a pampered doll, spoiled by a life that had never demanded anything of her. She was unworthy of the shelter she had been given, unworthy of the concern in Eli's eyes. Every spoonful of broth Eli took to Clara was an affront. Every clean blanket a waste of precious resources on something so fragile it was bound to break. Clara, in turn, saw Helena as a figure carved from stone. She saw the hardness in her eyes, the grim set of her mouth, the way she held her rifle as if it were a part of her own arm. She heard the judgment in Helena's silence, the territorial growl in her voice when she spoke. Clara had spent her life under the thumb of a harsh and judgmental authority, and Helena felt like a new kind of warden, one who patrolled the borders of this small sanctuary with a cold, unforgiving gaze. Eli found himself trapped in the crossfire of their silent war. He would rise in the dark and go about his chores, trying to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of ranch work. But the peace he had once found in his solitude was gone. Now, his mind was always on the cabin, on the two women circling each other within its walls. He was drawn to them both, and the feeling split him down the middle. He would watch Clara as she sat by the fire, her hands busy mending one of his shirts, her needlework fine and delicate. There was a quiet grace to her, a softness that seemed out of place in his rough-hewn world. It reminded him of a life he had only ever glimpsed from a distance, a life of warmth and order. Then his gaze would shift, and he would see Helena outside, splitting firewood with a strength that rivaled his own, her face set in grim concentration. Her fire was a wild thing, a defiant blaze against the cold, and he felt a pull toward that raw, untamed power, a deep respect for a will that refused to be broken. He was haunted by a separate guilt for each of them. With Helena, it was the memory of the burning wagon, a constant, nagging whisper that he had failed a fellow human in her darkest hour. With Clara, the guilt was older, deeper, a wound that had never properly healed. The sight of her, so vulnerable in his bed, brought the past rushing back with the force of a flash flood. He remembered it all with a clarity that time had not dimmed. It had been 5 years ago, on a cattle drive heading north. Clara had been there with her uncle, a fresh-faced girl of 16, her blue eyes wide with the adventure of it all. The other drovers were a hard lot, men who had spent too long in the company of cattle and whiskey, and they had looked at her with a hunger that made Eli's stomach turn. One night, the whiskey had flowed too freely. Her uncle had passed out in his bedroll, leaving her alone by the dying fire. 3 of the men, led by a swaggering bully named Cale, had cornered her. Eli had been checking the herd, but he heard her small cry of fear and came walking back into the firelight. He saw the way they had her boxed in, the ugly smiles on their faces, the terror in her eyes. He had not drawn his gun, he had simply walked up and stood between them, a silent, immovable object. "The girl is tired," he'd said, his voice low. "Leave her be." Cale had laughed. "She ain't your concern. Shepherd." "She is now," Eli had replied. The violence that followed was quick and ugly. Cale threw a punch, and Eli moved. Not to fight, but to end it. He broke Cale's nose with a single, brutal blow. The other 2, sobered by the sight of their leader spitting blood, had backed away. Eli had helped Clara to her feet, his touch gentle on her arm, and walked her back to her uncle's wagon. He never said another word to her. The next morning, Cale told the trail boss that Eli had started the fight, that he had been the one bothering the girl. It was 3 voices against 1. The trail boss, not wanting trouble, had paid Eli his wages and told him to ride on. He had left under a cloud of disgrace, with false accusations clinging to him like trail dust. It was that fight that had led to the shootout in Laramie weeks later, a chain of events that had ended with him having a bounty on his head and a reputation he could never outrun. He had chosen this isolated life not out of desire, but out of necessity. And now, the girl who had started it all was sleeping in his bed. Clara remembered that night too. She remembered the stink of whiskey on the men's breath and the terrifying darkness in their eyes. But most of all, she remembered Eli's shepherd stepping out of the shadows like an answer to a prayer she had been too afraid to speak. She remembered the solid set of his shoulders and the quiet authority in his voice. When he had helped her up, his hand had been rough with calluses, but his touch had been surprisingly tender. He had not looked at her with judgment or pity, only with a quiet concern. He had protected her, and he had paid the price for it. That memory was the reason she had torn down his wanted poster. It was a secret bond between them, a debt she felt she could never repay. Her gratitude was tangled up with a deeper, more complicated feeling, a girlish crush that had festered over the years into something more potent. He represented a different kind of man from the one she knew. He was not a man of God, like her father, who used scripture as a weapon. He was a man of quiet action, a man whose honor was a private thing, not something to be preached from a pulpit. Her shame was not just about running from her wedding. The shame was older, a secret she had carried for 2 years, a youthful indiscretion with a boy from a neighboring town, a moment of foolish, fumbled passion in a hayloft. It had meant little then, but it had become the defining fact of her existence when her father found out. He had called her a harlot, a vessel of sin, the marriage to Brother Abernathy. A cold, pious man with clammy hands was not a marriage at all. It was a punishment, a life sentence of penance. Fleeing was her only escape from a life of being constantly reminded of her fall from grace. Eli Shepherd knew nothing of this, but in her heart, she felt that he was the only person in the world who would not judge her for it. The fragile peace of the ranch depended on the weather. As long as the sky was clear, Eli and Helena could work outside, keeping a necessary distance. But the Wyoming winter was a fickle beast. One afternoon, the clouds rolled in again, thick and bruised, and a storm broke over the basin. It was not a blizzard this time, but a furious squall of freezing rain and sleet that turned the world to a slick gray misery. The wind howled, and the rain hammered against the roof of the cabin, trapping the three of them inside. For 2 days, they were prisoners in the small space. The air grew thick with unspoken resentments. Eli tried to busy himself, cleaning his rifles, mending tack, anything to avoid the suffocating tension. Clara tried to read from a small Bible she had brought, but the words blurred before her eyes. Helena sat by the fire, sharpening a skinning knife with slow, deliberate strokes, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone grating on everyone's nerves. The breaking point came on the second night. Eli had just brought in another armload of wood, the cold air clinging to him. The meal had been another silent, miserable affair. Clara, desperate to fill the silence, made a small comment about the weather, her voice thin and hopeful. "I do pray it clears soon," she said. "The sun feels like a distant memory." Helena looked up from her knife, her eyes glinting in the firelight. "Prayer is for children and fools. The sun will come when it comes. Your wishing will not change it." The condescension in her tone was a spark on dry tinder. All the fear and frustration that had been building in Clara for weeks finally erupted. "And what would you know of prayer?" Clara retorted, her voice trembling with sudden anger. "All you know is bitterness. You sit there with your rifle and your knives, judging everyone, as if the world owes you something for your suffering." Helena's hand stilled. "This world owes me nothing," she said, her voice dangerously low. "And it owes you less, you who have never suffered a real day in your life." "You know nothing about my life," Clara cried, jumping to her feet. "You think because you have seen hardship that you have the right to be cruel. Maybe if you were not so cold and bitter, your husband would still be alive. Maybe he just wanted to get away from you." It was a terrible, unforgivable thing to say. The words hung in the air, ugly and venomous. Helena's face went white. For a moment, she looked stunned, as if Clara had physically struck her. Then her expression hardened into a mask of pure fury. "You speak of things you do not understand, you foolish child," Helena snarled, rising slowly to her feet. "I am not a child," Clara shot back, her own pain making her reckless. "And you are not my mother. You are just a sour, lonely woman, bitter and past her prime, taking your misery out on anyone you can." Helena moved so fast Clara did not have time to react. Her hand flashed out, and the sound of the slap echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Clara stumbled back, her hand flying to her cheek, her eyes wide with shock and pain. Eli was between them in an instant, his hand grabbing Helena's arm, his body shielding Clara. "Enough!" he roared, his voice a clap of thunder that shook the room. He looked from Helena's furious, breathing face to Clara's tear-streaked one, and something inside him snapped. He was not angry at them. He was angry at the whole impossible, tangled mess. He felt a desperate need to escape, to breathe air that was not poisoned with their pain and his own. He released Helena's arm and turned, grabbing his coat from its peg. Without another word, he threw open the cabin door and stalked out into the raging storm, slamming the door behind him. The two women were left in the sudden, ringing silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. Clara sank onto a stool, covering her face with her hands, and began to weep, her shoulders shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. Helena stood frozen, her hands still tingling from the force of the blow. She looked at her own trembling fingers as if they belonged to a stranger. The anger drained out of her, leaving behind a hollow, shaken feeling. She looked at the weeping girl, at the red mark blooming on her pale cheek, and she felt no victory, only a deep, weary shame. Slowly, she went to the water basin, dipped a cloth in the cool water, and wrung it out. She walked over to Clara and knelt before her. Clara flinched as she approached, but Helena simply held out the damp cloth. "Here," she said, her voice rough but devoid of its earlier venom. "For your face." Clara looked up, her eyes red and swollen. Hesitantly, she took the cloth and pressed it to her stinging cheek. Helena remained kneeling for a moment longer, then rose and returned to her seat by the fire, her back to the girl. The silence returned, but it was different now. The tension had broken, and in its place was a fragile, aching quiet. Much later that night, the storm had quieted to a steady, drumming rain. Clara lay awake in Eli's bed, the scene replaying over and over in her mind. She was consumed with guilt, both for the cruel things she had said and for driving Eli out into the storm. She had to apologize. Slipping out of bed, she padded silently across the cold wooden floor to the tack room. The door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open gently. Eli sat on the edge of a small cot, his back to her, his coat still damp. He was staring at the wall, but she knew he was not seeing it. "Eli?" she whispered. He did not turn. "You should be asleep." "I came to apologize," she said, her voice trembling. "For what I said to her, and for making you so angry." He finally turned his head, and in the dim light from the main room, she saw the profound exhaustion on his face. "It is not your fault," he said, his voice flat. "This whole thing, it is my fault." "No," she said, stepping into the small room. "It is not." She moved closer until she was standing right in front of him. "You are a good man. Eli Shepherd, I know you are." He looked up at her, his expression torn. "You do not know me, Clara." "I know you saved me once," she said softly. "And you saved me again, pulling me out of the snow. I owe you everything." Overcome with a rush of emotion, gratitude, guilt, and a deep, aching loneliness, she leaned down and kissed him. Her lips were soft and hesitant against his rough, chapped ones. For a second, he was still, his body rigid with surprise. It was not a passionate kiss, but a desperate, pleading one. Then his hands came up, not to pull her closer, but to gently take her by the shoulders and push her away. "Do not," he said, his voice a low, pained rasp. "Clara, you cannot." The rejection was a fresh wound, and shame washed over her. She stumbled back, her face burning. "I am sorry," she whispered, turning to flee. He did not call after her. He just sat there, his head in his hands, a man torn apart by his own private war. As Clara hurried back across the main room, a floorboard creaked near the hearth. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. A figure detached itself from the shadows by the fireplace. It was Helena. She had been standing there the whole time, a silent witness. She held her rifle in one hand, its stock resting on the floor. She said nothing. She did not have to. Her eyes, two chips of ice in the darkness, met Clara's, and they were filled with a cold, devastating knowledge. The look cut deeper than any slap, a silent accusation of betrayal that promised a new and terrible dawn. The morning after the storm broke cold and unnervingly bright. The silence in the cabin was a fourth presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from guilt and unspoken accusations. Eli rose before dawn, his movements stiff and deliberate. He did not look at either woman. He took his coffee standing, his back to the room, and was out the door before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge. Clara and Helena moved around each other with the cautious, deliberate grace of two predators sharing a too small territory. Clara's cheek still bore the faint ghost of a blush from Helena's hand. Helena's eyes were shuttered, her face a stone mask. Clara tried to speak once, a small, whispered apology, but Helena cut her off with a sharp gesture and walked out, grabbing the axe as she went. The rhythmic thud of splitting wood was the only conversation for the rest of the day. That night, Eli returned late, smelling of pine and sweat. He had spoken to a neighbor 10 miles down the valley, a man named Peterson, and taken a job hauling timber from a burn scar on the mountain. He announced it without preamble as he cleaned his plate. "I will be gone for 2 days," he said, his eyes fixed on the table. "There is enough firewood. The animals are fed." It was not a request or a discussion. It was a retreat. He was escaping the confines of the cabin, fleeing the emotional crossfire he could no longer endure. When he left the next morning, the space he left behind felt both emptier and somehow more charged, the pressure in the cabin now having nowhere to go. The first day passed in silence. Clara mended clothes, her stitches tiny and perfect, a desperate attempt to impose order on a world that felt chaotic. Helena worked outside, her energy furious and relentless, as if she could physically beat back the memories of the night before. By the evening of the second day, a fragile, unspoken truce had formed. Helena no longer looked at Clara with open contempt, and Clara no longer flinched when the older woman entered the room. That evening, Clara took a lantern to the barn to check on the calf they had saved. It was growing stronger, its coat filling out. She sat in the hay, stroking its small head, finding a measure of peace in the quiet, animal warmth of the place. She must have dozed off, lulled by the rustling hay and the gentle sounds of the livestock. She awoke to the smell of smoke. At first, it was just a faint, acrid scent, but it grew stronger with alarming speed. She sat up, her heart lurching. The lantern, which she had set on a wooden crate, was gone. In its place, a small, hungry tongue of orange flame was licking at the dry, splintered wood. A sudden gust of wind rattled the barn door, and the flame leaped, catching a pile of loose hay. Panic seized her, cold and absolute. The hay ignited with a terrifying whoosh, and in seconds, a wall of fire was climbing toward the loft. The animals began to shift and cry out, their fear a tangible thing in the suddenly hot, thick air. Clara scrambled backward, coughing, her mind blank with terror. The smoke was a choking cloud, and the only exit was blocked by a curtain of flame. The barn door burst open, and a figure was sillaged against the snow-lit yard. It was Helena. She had no rifle, no weapon, only a wet horse blanket held in front of her. "Get down!" Helena yelled, her voice a raw command that cut through Clara's panic. Clara dropped to her belly, pressing her face against the dirt floor where the air was clearer. Helena charged through the edge of the flames, using the wet blanket as a shield. She reached Clara, grabbing her by the collar of her dress with a grip of iron. "Crawl!" she screamed, and began dragging her toward the door. The heat was intense, a physical blow. The roar of the fire was deafening. Clara could feel the skin on her back prickling, her hair crackling. Helena did not let go. She pulled and pushed, her breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps, her strength astonishing. They burst out of the doorway and collapsed onto the snow, gasping for air, their lungs burning. Behind them, the barn was an inferno. The roof was engulfed in flames that clawed at the night sky, sending a shower of sparks into the wind. Half the structure was already gone. They had made it out with only seconds to spare. Clara lay on the snow, shaking, a raw, ragged cough tearing from her throat. Helena was on her hands and knees beside her, equally spent. Soot blackened her face. and her shawl was singed at the edges. She looked at the burning barn, at the destruction of their winter stores of hay, at the loss of a building that was essential for survival. Then she looked at Clara. Clara expected an explosion of rage, a torrent of blame. Instead, Helena simply reached out a hand and pushed a stray, smoking strand of hair from Clara's face. Her touch was rough, impatient, but it was not unkind. "You are alive," Helena said, the words a simple statement of fact. Then she got to her feet and began the grim, hopeless task of trying to save what little she could. Eli returned at dawn to a scene of devastation. The barn was a smoldering, skeletal ruin, a black wound against the white snow. The air smelled of char and wet ash. He slid from his horse, his face a grim mask. His first thought a cold spike of fear for the two women. He found them in the cabin. Clara was asleep on his bed, exhausted, a small, clean blister on the back of her hand. Helena was sitting at the table, her face smudged with soot, her eyes red-rimmed from smoke and exhaustion. She was cleaning her rifle, her movements slow and weary. "What happened?" Eli asked, his voice low. "The girl, a lamp," Helena said, not looking up. She did not elaborate. She did not have to. The blame was there, unspoken. But so was something else. The fact that Clara was alive and sleeping safely in his bed spoke volumes. Helena had saved her. A profound and complicated silence settled between them. He knew what she had done. He knew that in the moment of crisis, this hard, bitter woman had risked her own life for the girl she claimed to despise. He walked over to the stove and put on a pot of coffee, his movements betraying none of the turmoil inside him. Something had changed. The ground beneath their feet had irrevocably shifted. In the days that followed, the shift was subtle but undeniable. Helena still spoke to Clara in clipped, practical tones, but the cutting edge was gone. One afternoon, as she was skinning a rabbit, she looked over at Clara, who was watching with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. "Stop staring like a startled fawn," Helena said, though without her usual heat. "If you are going to eat, you should know where it comes from." A week ago, she would have called her child. The omission was not lost on Clara. That evening, Helena came in from the cold, her own rifle in one hand and her dead husband's revolver in the other. She stopped in front of Clara. "It is time you learned to be useful for something other than starting fires," she said. "Tomorrow, I will teach you how to shoot." Eli witnessed all of this, a silent observer to their fragile, budding alliance. The tension in the cabin had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something else, something quieter and more complex. He felt a need to acknowledge it, to contribute to the delicate peace. The next time he went to the small trading post at South Pass for supplies, he returned with two small, carefully wrapped parcels. He gave one to Clara. Inside was a pair of sturdy leather boots, much warmer and more practical than the flimsy shoes she had arrived in. He handed the other to Helena. It was a new leather strap for her rifle, expertly tooled and supple. Neither woman said thank you, but Clara's cheeks flushed a pretty pink as she stroked the soft leather of the boots, and Helena ran a thumb over the new strap with an expression that was almost soft. Both of them avoided his eyes, but he saw the small, pleased blushes, and it was enough. The shooting lesson took place on a cold, clear afternoon. Helena set up a row of tin cans on a fence post 50 yards away. She handed Clara the revolver first. "It is a man's gun," she said. "Heavy, it will kick. Hold it with both hands. Do not fight it. Let it become a part of your arm." Her instructions were blunt and practical. She showed Clara how to stand, how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger instead of jerking it. Clara was clumsy at first, the gun loud and unwieldy in her hands. Her first few shots went wide, kicking up puffs of snow far from the targets. "You are thinking too much," Helena chided. "Stop trying to aim. Just look at the can, see it in your mind, and then point the gun where you are looking." Clara closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and did as she was told. She opened her eyes, focused on the center can, raised the heavy revolver, and fired. The can jumped off the post and spun through the air. Helena grunted, a sound of surprise. Luck! Clara fired again. A second can flew off the post. She fired a third time, and then a fourth. By the time the revolver was empty, all 5 cans were lying in the snow. Clara stood there, her arm trembling, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the cold air, a look of stunned surprise on her own face. Helena stared at the fallen cans, then back at Clara, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. It was the first time Clara had ever seen her smile, and it transformed her, softening the hard lines and lighting a spark in her stormy eyes. Helena let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated surprise. Well, I will be, she said, shaking her head. The preacher's daughter has a killer's eye. Clara laughed too, a light, bubbling sound of relief and pride. For the first time since she had arrived, she did not feel like a burden or an intruder. They stood there in the snow, 2 women from different worlds, and for a moment, they were not rivals. They were equals. That night, as they sat by the fire, a new ease between them. Clara found the courage to speak. Helena, she began, her voice soft. I know you do not trust me, and I have given you no reason to, but I want you to know, I am not the person you think I am. Helena continued to stitch a patch on a pair of Eli's trousers, but she was listening. I am ashamed of my past, Clara confessed, her eyes on the flames. Of why I ran away, but I am not ashamed to be here. I want to stay, not just because it is safe, but because of him, because of Eli. She finally looked at Helena, her expression earnest and pleading. I think he could be my future. Helena finished her stitch and bit off the thread, her movements precise. She looked at Clara, her expression unreadable. Futures are for people who believe in fairy tales, she said, her voice low and even. I used to believe in them. I believed in the church, in the sanctity of marriage, in a man's promise to protect me. She paused, and a shadow passed over her face. Men die, churches lie, and women rot alone unless they learn to take what they need. Right here, right now. There is no future, girl. There is only today, and whether you have the strength to survive until tomorrow. Her words were a cold dose of reality, a philosophy born of unimaginable hardship. But there was no malice in them, only a hard-won, bitter truth. A few nights later, the 3 of them sat down to dinner. For the first time, there was no suffocating tension, no silent warfare. They spoke of the ranch, of the coming spring, of the work that needed to be done to rebuild the barn. The conversation was simple, practical, but it was easy. As Eli reached for the salt, his hand brushed against both of theirs where they rested on the table. It was a fleeting, accidental touch, but for a long moment, no one pulled away. The contact was a small, warm current in the cold cabin, a silent acknowledgement of the new and complex web that was being woven between them. The moment was shattered by the sound of a horse approaching. Eli was on his feet in an instant, moving to the door, his hand resting on the butt of the pistol tucked into his belt. Helena already had a rifle, its muzzle pointed toward the floor, but ready. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Visitors were rare. Night visitors were a threat. A man's voice called out from the darkness. Eli Shepherd, it is Sheriff Hallen. I am coming in alone. Eli's body went rigid. He opened the door a crack. A tall, thin man with a pinched face and cold, pale eyes stood on the porch, his hand held away from his gun. Sheriff Hallen? Eli had not seen him in 5 years. Not since Laramie, but he recognized the self-righteous glint in his eyes. Hallen had always carried a grudge. What do you want, Hallen? Eli's voice was a low growl. The sheriff's eyes moved past Eli, taking in the scene inside the cabin. He saw Helena with her rifle, and his eyes lingered on Clara, a flicker of recognition in his gaze. A slow, unpleasant smile touched his lips. "Just making my rounds. Shepherd," he said, his voice laced with insinuation. "Heard some interesting talk in town. About a runaway bride, daughter of a preacher over in Sweetwater." He looked directly at Clara, whose face had gone deathly pale. "Girl fits your description." Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her. He knew. Her past had found her. Holland turned his attention back to Eli. "Now, I am sure it is all just gossip, but you know the law. Harboring a fugitive, well, that is a serious offense, especially for a man with your history." He let the threat hang in the air. "I would hate to have to come back here with a warrant. I suggest you send the girl on her way. For your own good." He tipped his hat, a gesture of mock politeness, and turned, melting back into the darkness. The sound of his horse's hoofbeats faded, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Clara began to tremble, a low whimper escaping her lips. The world was shrinking again, the walls closing in. She was going to be sent back to her father, back to a life of shame and punishment. "He cannot," she whispered, shaking her head. "He cannot take me back." Helena moved to her side, her presence solid and reassuring. She still held the rifle. "No one is taking you anywhere," she said, her voice fierce. Eli closed the door and leaned against it, his face grim. "I will handle Hallen," he said, his voice a low promise. "I will protect you both." But the sheriff's visit had broken something in Clara. The fragile sense of safety she had begun to feel was shattered. The dam of her composure broke, and she collapsed into sobs, a storm of fear and despair that she could no longer contain. Helena hesitated for only a second. Then she set her rifle against the wall and wrapped her arms around the weeping girl. She held her, not with gentleness, but with a fierce, protective strength, rocking her slightly as one might soothe a terrified animal. Clara clung to her, burying her face in the rough wool of Helena's dress, her tears soaking the fabric. Eli walked in from the doorway and stopped, watching the two women. He saw Helena, the woman who had lost everything, comforting Clara, the girl who was terrified of losing the little she had found. He saw the scars on Helena's soul reaching out to the wounds on Clara's, and in that moment, watching them cling to each other in the warm, flickering light of his cabin, something inside his own walled-off heart softened and broke open. That night, Eli lay on his cot in the tack room, staring into the darkness. He could not sleep. The sheriff's threat, Clara's terror, Helena's unexpected tenderness, it all churned within him. The door creaked open. He did not need to see the silhouette to know who it was. Helena stepped into the room, a ghost in her long white nightgown. She closed the door behind her, shutting out the faint light from the main room, plunging them into near total darkness. She said nothing. She walked to the foot of his cot and slowly, deliberately, began to unbutton her nightgown. He heard the whisper of the fabric as she shrugged it from her shoulders, letting it fall in a pool at her feet. She stood before him in the dark, a pale, naked form. He could just make out the faint, silvery lines that crisscrossed her body, the scars on her back, her ribs, the side of her hip. A map of a brutal history, a testament to a pain he could only imagine. She was not offering him pleasure. She was offering him her truth. She was showing him every broken piece of her, every flaw, every mark of the man who had hurt her. And she was asking him a question without words. When she finally spoke, her voice was a raw, trembling whisper in the absolute dark. "After all this," she said, her voice thick with a pain that went far beyond the physical. "After all you have seen, can you still want me?" Eli rose from the cot. He moved toward her until he could feel the warmth of her body. He reached out, not to caress her, but to trace the path of a long, faded scar on her back with his rough fingertips. He felt her flinch, then lean into his touch. "Yes," he said, his voice as raw and honest as her own. "Yes." He drew her to him, and their union was not one of gentle romance. It was a raw, desperate collision of two lonely, wounded souls. It was full of the quiet fury of survival, of a deep, aching longing for a warmth they had both been denied for too long. It was a silent promise in the dark. You are not alone in your pain. Out in the main room, a floorboard creaked. Clara stood in the hallway, her hand pressed over her mouth to stifle a sob. She had heard the whispered words, had seen Helena's shadow slip into his room. She listened now to the muffled sounds of their desperate, honest grief, and she trembled, a silent witness to a union forged in fire and scars. The dawn that followed was a fragile truce, in the sharp, unforgiving light of morning. The events of the night before seemed both impossible and undeniable. A heavy silence hung in the cabin, thick with things unsaid. Helena was the first to rise, moving with a contained, deliberate energy that signaled a retreat into herself. She stoked the fire, fetched water, and measured out coffee grounds, her movements economical and precise. She did not look at Clara, her focus entirely on the familiar mechanics of survival, as if ignoring the girl would somehow erase the memory of her own vulnerability in the dark. Clara lay still in her bed, watching Helena through her lashes, her heart a tangled knot of confusion, jealousy, and a strange, aching sympathy. She had heard everything, the whispered confession, the raw grief in their union. She felt like an intruder in her own home, a witness to a sacrament she did not understand. When Eli finally emerged from the tack room, he looked as if he had not slept at all, but his face was calm, his expression unreadable. He acted as if nothing had happened. But something in him had changed. His usual gruffness was tempered with a new and unfamiliar gentleness. He poured coffee for Helena first, his hand steady as he placed the tin mug on the table beside her. Then he poured a mug for Clara, and when she sat up to take it, their fingers brushed. He held her gaze for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, his eyes offering a quiet reassurance that he did not have the words for. He moved between them like a man trying to balance a delicate scale, offering a quiet word to one, a small, helpful gesture to the other, a silent acknowledgement that their separate worlds had collided, and he was now the only ground they shared. The charade of normalcy could not last. That afternoon, Clara found Helena behind the half-rebuilt frame of the barn, sorting through salvaged tools. The air was cold, smelling of snow and charred timber. Clara's hands were trembling, but she would not let the silence fester any longer. "Helena," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The older woman continued her work, her back to Clara. "What is it?" "Last night," Clara began, her throat tight. "With Eli." She took a breath, forcing herself to ask the question that had been tormenting her. "Did it mean anything?" Helena stopped what she was doing. She straightened up slowly, her shoulders stiff. For a long time, she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the distant, snow-dusted peaks of the mountains. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and rough, as if the words were being dredged up from some deep, painful place. "It meant everything," she said. Clara's heart sank, the word a confirmation of her worst fears. But then Helena continued, "But not everything is a betrayal." She turned then, and her stormy eyes met Clara's. The defensiveness was gone, replaced by a raw, weary honesty. "You think it was about him choosing me over you? You think it was about desire? Child, you do not understand. That was not about wanting. That was about surviving. Two people who have been walking through hell for so long they have forgotten what warmth feels like. Finding a single, flickering candle in the dark." Her voice broke, just for a moment. "It was a prayer, a confession, a promise that we are not entirely dead yet. It was not a betrayal of you. It was a betrayal of the past, of the ghosts that have been trying to bury us. The words settled over Clara, disarming her jealousy and replacing it with a profound, aching understanding. She was not looking at a rival. She was looking at a woman who had simply been in more pain, for longer than she could possibly imagine. Later that day, they walked together to the small river that cut through the basin. It was half frozen, the water moving dark and sluggish beneath a scrim of ice. They sat on a fallen log, the silence between them no longer a weapon, but a shared space. It was Helena who spoke first, her gaze on the black water. "Grief is a quiet thing," she said, her voice distant. "People think it is loud, all wailing and tearing of clothes, but it is not. It is a hollow space inside you, a room in your heart where someone used to live, and now it is just empty and cold." She absent-mindedly touched her side, where a long, thin scar disappeared beneath her dress. "My husband. He filled that room with noise, with pain. I thought that was what love was, the sound of a man's anger proving he was still there." She took a shaky breath. "With Eli, last night, it was the first time I have been touched by a man in 10 years that was not a blow. The silence of it. That is what I cannot stop thinking about, the quiet." Clara listened, her own heart aching in sympathy. She finally understood that the scars Helena carried were not just on her skin. When Helena fell silent, Clara found her own voice, small but steady. "My pain is shame," she confessed, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "It is not a hollow room. It is a stain, something that covers you, so that when people look, it is all they see." She told Helena everything then, about the boy in the hayloft, about her father's cold, unforgiving piety, about the marriage that was meant to be a punishment. "He made me believe the shame was all I was, that I was ruined, unworthy of kindness, or a gentle touch." She looked at her own hands, twisting them in her lap. "When I kissed Eli, it was because he was the only man who ever looked at me and did not see the stain. He just saw me." They sat there for a long time, two women by a frozen river, each offering up the name of her ghost, and in that shared confession, they began to see each other not as rivals for a man's affection, but as fellow survivors of a harsh and unforgiving world. The rivalry died on that riverbank, and in its place, a fragile, tentative understanding began to grow. The next afternoon, Eli saddled all 3 horses. "There is a place I want you to see," was all he said. He led them up a winding trail that climbed the side of the basin, the air growing thinner and colder. They rode in a comfortable silence, the new dynamic between them settling into a natural rhythm. They emerged onto a high, wind-swept bluff that overlooked the entire valley. The ranch was a tiny, toy-like cluster of buildings below. The whole world seemed to spread out before them, a vast, silent expanse of white snow and blue shadow under a sky of deepening orange and violet. They dismounted and stood at the edge of the cliff, watching the sun bleed its last colors across the horizon. The beauty of it was so vast and profound it left no room for words. As the last sliver of sun disappeared, a deep chill settled over the land. In the gathering twilight, Clara felt a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness, a fear that this moment of peace was just a fleeting dream. Acting on an impulse she did not fully understand, she reached out and slipped her small, gloved hand into Eli's much larger one. He did not pull away. He simply tightened his grip, his calloused fingers a warm, solid anchor in the cold. A moment later, another hand, weathered and strong, settled over both of theirs. It was Helena. She stood beside them, her touch a quiet benediction, her presence a firm, unyielding statement. The 3 of them stood there as one, their hands joined, 3 solitary figures silhouetted against the dying light, a silent, unspoken pact being forged in the immense silence of the Wyoming wilderness. That night, the fire in the cabin seemed to burn warmer, A sense of peace, fragile but real, had settled in the small space. After Helena had banked the embers and retired to the bed Eli had insisted she now take, Clara found she could not sleep. The memory of their 3 hands joined together was a warm coal in her chest. She went to him in the tack room. He was sitting on his cot, oiling a piece of leather, the lantern casting a low, golden glow around him. He looked up as she entered, his expression questioning. She did not speak. She walked to him, knelt before him, and took his face in her hands. She kissed him, and this time, it was not the desperate, pleading kiss of a frightened girl. It was a kiss of profound and heartfelt tenderness. A question asked not with words, but with a gentle pressure of her lips. A kiss that said, "I see you. Do you see me?" He did not push her away. His hands came up to rest on her waist, his touch hesitant. But before the kiss could deepen, a sound from the doorway made them both freeze. Helena stood there, framed in the doorway, her long braid hanging over the shoulder of her white nightgown. She was not a shadow of judgment this time. Her face, illuminated by the lantern light, was calm, her stormy eyes filled with a deep, searching wisdom. She did not move, did not speak. She simply watched them. Eli gently broke the kiss, his eyes leaving Clara's to find Helena's in the doorway. He did not let go of Clara, but his gaze was fixed on the other woman. It was a look of profound conflict, of uncertainty. He was trapped between 2 worlds, 2 needs, 2 futures. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. Then, Helena took a step into the room, then another. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her eyes never leaving Eli's. She stopped beside them, so close that Clara could feel the warmth radiating from her. Slowly, Helena reached out. She did not pull Clara away. Instead, she gently took Clara's hand, her fingers lacing through the younger woman's. Then she reached out her other hand and laid it on Eli's cheek, her thumb stroking the rough line of his jaw. What happened next was a quiet, hesitant thing, born not of lust, but of a profound and desperate hunger for acceptance. Eli's hand moved from Clara's waist to cover Helena's where it rested on his cheek. He turned his head and pressed a kiss into her calloused palm. Clara, her hand still held in Helena's, leaned forward and rested her head against Eli's shoulder, a gesture of surrender and trust. No one spoke. There were no words for this. It was a slow, overwhelming tide of emotion. 3 broken hearts finding a common shore. It was the rough texture of Eli's shirt against Clara's cheek, the surprising softness of Helena's hand, the scent of wood smoke and leather and pine that seemed to cling to them all. It was the sight of tears welling in Helena's eyes, tears not of sorrow, but of a release so profound it had no name. It was the feeling of Eli's arms, strong and sure, eventually encircling them both, pulling them into a tight, protective embrace. They were not a man and 2 women. They were a refuge, a sanctuary built in the heart of a storm, a place where shame and grief could finally be laid down, and where 3 lonely souls could find warmth enough to stay until dawn. The first light of morning found Clara dressing in the dark, her movements clumsy with a new and unfamiliar shame. The tenderness of the night before seemed like a fever dream in the cold. Gray light. The world had rules. God had rules. What they had done broke all of them. She was ruined, truly and completely ruined now. There was only one thing to do. She had to leave. She packed her few meager belongings into a small bundle. She would walk, just as Helena had. She did not know where she would go, only that she could not stay. She could not face them in the light of day. She was tying her bundle when a hand fell on her shoulder. She jumped, whirling around. It was Helena. She was already dressed, her face calm and clear in the dim light. "What are you doing?" Helena asked, her voice quiet. "I have to go," Clara whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I cannot stay. After last night, it was wrong." Helena's grip on her shoulder tightened, not with anger, but with an unshakable firmness. "Look at me," she commanded. Clara reluctantly raised her eyes. "There was nothing wrong about last night," Helena said, her voice low and fierce. "We were not breaking rules. We were making our own. We were not sinning. We were healing." She looked deep into Clara's eyes, her gaze willing the girl to understand. "Listen to me. For 20 years, I lived in a house with one man, and I was more alone than I have ever been in my life. Last night, in that room with you and him, for the first time since I was a child, I was not alone." Her voice grew thick with emotion. "We did not steal something from each other. We made something. We made a family last night. You do not run from that." The words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow, scattering her shame and replacing it with a startling, radical hope. A family. A family forged not by law or by blood, but by a shared need so profound it had created its own rules. Eli appeared in the doorway then, drawn by their voices. He looked at Clara's bundle, at Helena's hand on her shoulder, and he understood everything. He walked over to them, his expression serious. "She is right," he said, his voice a low rumble. "No one is leaving." He looked from one woman to the other, his gaze holding them both. "I do not know what this is," he said, his honesty raw and simple. "I do not have a name for it. All I know is that my whole life, I have been running, from the law, from my past, from myself. I am tired of running. This place, with you two, this is the first time I have ever wanted to stand my ground." He reached out, taking Clara's free hand in one of his, and Helena's in the other. He held them, a man anchoring two worlds. "So we make a new rule," he said, his voice firm. "No more lies, no more shame, no more running from the past. Just this, the ranch, the work, and the three of us. Whatever future we can build, we build it together." Helena squeezed his hand, a slow smile touching her lips. Clara looked at their joined hands, at the two people who had taken her in and shown her a different kind of grace. And for the first time, the stain of her shame began to fade, washed clean by the promise of a new and braver day. She squeezed back. They would stay together. The spring fought its way into existence. It came not as a gentle guest, but as a brawler, with freezing rains one day and a brilliant, thawing sun the next. The snow receded in dirty patches, revealing the pale, hungry earth beneath. The river swelled, its voice changing from a winter whisper to a spring roar, and, on the ranch, a new and quiet life took root. They worked. The rhythm of the seasons became the rhythm of their days. They rebuilt the barn, the sound of Eli's hammer a steady heartbeat against the silence of the valley. Helena, with her grim, practical knowledge, directed the work, while Clara, surprisingly quick and eager to learn, passed him the timbers and pegs. They moved as a unit, their separate strengths weaving together into a single, efficient whole. The ranch, which had been a place of solitary survival for Eli, began to thrive under their combined care. The cattle grew fat on the new grass. A small vegetable garden was tilled and planted, and the cabin itself seemed to breathe easier, filled now not just with a solitary man's presence, but with the scent of baking bread and the low murmur of conversation. They lived quietly, their world shrinking to the borders of the property line. But the world outside had not forgotten them. When Eli had to ride to the trading post at South Pass for supplies, he would return with his jaw tight, his eyes hard. The whispers followed him, the sideways glances, the sudden silences when he entered a room. He never told the women what was said, but they knew. The story of the preacher's runaway daughter and the reclusive rancher with two women under his roof had become the stuff of town gossip, a tasty morsel of scandal for people whose lives were otherwise dull and hard. Eli did not care, or rather, he had made a choice not to care. One Sunday, he hitched the wagon. "We are going to church," he announced, his tone leaving no room for argument. Clara's face went pale. "Eli, we cannot—" "They will talk whether we are there or not," he said, his voice firm. "Let them talk to our faces. We will not hide." They sat together in a pew near the back of the small, clapboard church. Their entrance caused a ripple of whispers and stares that followed them like a physical touch. Eli sat in the middle, a solid, immovable mountain between Helena and Clara. He did not look at the other congregants. He simply stared ahead at the plain wooden cross on the wall, his presence a silent challenge. Pastor Green was a small man with a big voice, and he had clearly been waiting for this moment. He did not mention them by name, but his sermon was a thinly veiled attack, a torrent of fire and brimstone aimed directly at their pew. He spoke of Sodom and Gomorrah, of the abomination of unnatural unions, of the den of iniquity that could fester even in a God-fearing community. His eyes kept flicking toward them, his face flushed with righteous zeal. Clara shrank into herself, the familiar shame washing over her, hot and suffocating. She felt every eye in the church on her, every word a stone cast in her direction. But then she felt a hand on her arm. It was Helena, her grip firm, her expression unyielding, and on her other side, Eli sat as still as granite, unmoved by the pastor's venom. He was their shield, and he would not be broken. They endured the sermon and the hostile stares that followed them out of the church, but their ordeal was not over. As they reached their wagon, a man stepped out from the crowd to block their path. He was tall and severe, dressed in a black preacher's coat, his face a mask of cold fury. It was Clara's father, the Reverend Michael Thompson. "Clara," he said, his voice like a spade hitting frozen ground. "You will come with me now." Clara froze, all the blood draining from her face. It was her nightmare made real. Eli stepped in front of her, placing himself between Clara and her father. "The lady is with me," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The Reverend Thompson's eyes, chips of cold blue ice, dismissed Eli as if he were nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle. "This is a family matter," he snapped. "I have come to collect my property." "She is not property," Eli said, his voice dropping even lower. "And you will not touch her. Now step aside." For a moment, no one moved. The townspeople who had gathered to watch held their breath, the Reverend's face contorted with rage. He looked past Eli at his daughter, who was cowering behind him. "You have shamed our name," he hissed at her. "You have laid with this sinner, this animal. You are ruined." He then did something that shocked even the hardened onlookers. He drew back and spat, the glob of spittle landing on the hem of Clara's dress. Something broke in Eli. The quiet, contained man disappeared, replaced by a primal rage. He did not say a word. His fist shot out, a blur of motion, and connected with the Reverend Thompson's jaw with a sickening crack. The preacher went down like a sack of grain, landing in a heap in the dusty street. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Before anyone could react, Helena, who had moved around the other side of the wagon, raised her rifle. She did not aim it at any one person, but swept the barrel slowly across the stunned faces of the townspeople, her expression as cold and deadly as a winter storm. "Listen to me, all of you," she said, her voice ringing out with absolute authority. "This is our family. That is our home." She gestured with the rifle barrel back toward the mountains. "Anyone, preacher, sheriff, or concerned citizen, who dares to trespass on our land or lay a hand on one of us will be shot. That is not a threat. It is the only sermon you will get from me." She held their gazes for a long, silent moment, letting the weight of her promise sink in. Then she helped Clara into the wagon, and Eli, his hand still throbbing, climbed up beside them. He slapped the reins, and the wagon moved through the parted crowd, leaving Clara's father groaning in the dust and the townspeople in a state of shocked silence. Back at the ranch, the violent confrontation in town seemed to solidify their bond, burning away any remaining uncertainty. They were no longer three individuals seeking shelter together. They were a unit, a clan, defined and defended by their own laws. They threw themselves into the work of the ranch, finding a healing rhythm in their shared labor. Helena, seeing the deep-seated fear that the confrontation had reawakened in Clara, took the girl under her wing. She taught her the brutal, beautiful realities of their world. She showed her how to birth a calf, her hands gentle but firm as she helped the struggling mother. She taught her how to set a splint on a foal's leg, how to read the clouds for a coming storm, how to find the North Star in a moonless sky. She was passing on the tools of her own survival, forging the girl's fear into a new and unfamiliar strength. Clara, in turn, brought a softness and a sense of home to the rough cabin. She sang as she worked, her clear voice a surprising and welcome sound in the quiet valley. She stitched new curtains for the window, mended their clothes with a skill that was almost magical, and found wild herbs to make their simple meals more savory. She was not just occupying the space, she was transforming it, turning the rustic shelter into a sanctuary. And Eli built, he felled trees and hewed logs with a focused, tireless energy. With his own hands, he built a new room onto the side of the cabin. It was not large, but it had its own window and a small stone fireplace. It was a room for the women, a space of their own, a physical manifestation of his commitment to this new life they were creating. The sound of his hammer was a declaration. This is permanent. This is our home. At night, the cabin was a fortress against the world. Love, they discovered, was not just the raw, healing passion they sometimes shared in the darkness. It was in the quiet moments. It was the taste of shared bread after a long day's work. It was the sound of Helena's rare, gruff laughter at something Clara said. It was the sight of Eli, his face softened in sleep by the firelight. It was the profound peace of sitting together in the stillness after a storm, knowing they were safe, knowing they were not alone. But the world they had defied was not so easily kept at bay. The peace did not last. Sheriff Hallen returned on a hot afternoon in early summer. He was not alone this time. He had 2 deputies with him, their faces hard and impassive. Eli saw them coming from a long way off and met them in the yard. His stance relaxed, but his hand never far from his side. Helena and Clara watched from the cabin doorway, a shotgun now always kept loaded and ready just inside. "Shepherd," Hallen said, dismounting. He did not bother with pleasantries. He held up a piece of paper. "This is a warrant, issued by the circuit judge. You are under arrest." "For what?" Eli asked, his voice dangerously calm. "Harboring a fugitive," Hallen said, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "That would be the girl, Clara Mae Thompson, whose father has filed a formal complaint. And for obstructing justice and assaulting a man of the cloth, that would be you, punching the good reverend in the street." Eli knew it was a fight he could not win. Not here, not now. To resist would only lead to a shootout, and he would not risk the women's lives. He looked back at them, a silent message passing between them. "Do not fight, not yet." He held out his hands. "All right, Hallen, you win this round." The deputies cuffed his hands behind his back and put him on a horse. As they rode away, Eli did not look back. He did not have to. He knew Helena and Clara were watching, and he knew they would not let this be the end. The moment the riders were out of sight, Helena turned to Clara, her eyes blazing with a cold fire. "Hitch the wagon," she said, "and pack the shotguns." They rode through the night, a grim and silent pair. Helena drove the horses with a relentless urgency, her face set like stone. Clara sat beside her, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, but her resolve was a hot coal in her heart. They had hidden the 2 shotguns under a pile of blankets in the wagon bed. They did not have a plan, not a clear one, but they were not about to let Eli face this alone. They arrived at the small county jail in South Pass just as the first pale light of dawn was breaking. The town was still asleep. They parked the wagon across the street and waited. An hour later, Sheriff Hallen emerged from his office, a cup of coffee in his hand. He saw them, and his face hardened. He strode over to the wagon. "You two should have kept on riding," he said. "There is nothing for you here." "We have come for Eli," Helena said, her voice flat. "He is not going anywhere," Hallen sneered. "He will see the judge in a week, and then he will likely see the inside of a federal prison." It was then that Clara spoke. She had been silent the whole journey, gathering her courage, piece by piece. She stood up in the wagon, and her voice, when it came, was not the timid whisper of a frightened girl. It was clear and steady, and it carried across the quiet morning air. "You are wrong, Sheriff," she said. Hallen turned to her, a look of contempt on his face. "This does not concern you, girl. Go home to your father." "I am home," Clara said, her voice gaining strength. Several townspeople, early risers on their way to work, had stopped to listen. "And my father's house is not a home. It is a prison, just like the one you have put Eli in." She looked past the sheriff, at the small crowd that was beginning to gather. She took a deep breath and spoke, her words tumbling out, a torrent of truth she had held inside for too long. "You all whisper about me," she said, her voice ringing with passion. "You call me a sinner. The preacher calls me ruined. My father calls me his property. You speak of my shame, but you do not know the meaning of the word." She pointed a trembling finger toward the jail. "That man in there, Eli Shepherd, he found me half dead in the snow, and he took me in. He clothed me and fed me and protected me. He has never asked for anything in return. He showed me a kindness I had never known. That is the man you have arrested." Her gaze swept over the crowd. "You want to know about shame? I will tell you about shame. Shame is a father who would marry his daughter to a man she despises, simply to punish her. Shame is a preacher who uses the word of God as a whip to keep a woman in her place. Shame is a world that allows men like my father to walk free, while a good man like Eli is put in chains for an act of simple human decency." A profound silence fell over the street. The townspeople were no longer looking at her as a curiosity, a piece of gossip. They were seeing a woman, raw and eloquent, speaking a truth that resonated deep in their own hard lives. They saw the fire in her eyes, the conviction in her voice, and they were moved. Sheriff Hallen looked around, unnerved by the shifting mood of the crowd. He was a man who understood the law, but he did not understand this. His grudge with Eli was a personal matter, but it was quickly turning into a public spectacle, and he was on the wrong side of it. An old blacksmith, a man respected in the town, spoke up from the crowd. "The girl has a point. Hallen, this whole business stinks." A murmur of agreement went through the onlookers. The sheriff was a man who depended on the goodwill of these people. He could not afford to alienate them over a personal vendetta. He was trapped. He glared at Clara, then at Helena, who sat holding the reins, her hand resting near the blankets that concealed the shotguns. He knew he was beaten, for now. With a curse under his breath, he turned and stomped back to the jail. A few minutes later, he emerged with Eli. His hands unbound, Eli walked straight to the wagon, his eyes only for the two women. He looked at Clara with a new and profound respect. She had done what he never could. She had used her voice, and she had won. As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Hallen walked up one last time, his face a mask of cold fury. "You have won this round. Shepherd," he hissed, his voice low so only they could hear. "You and your women. You have turned the town against me for a day, but do not fool yourselves. They will never let you be. The world is not made for people like you." He turned and walked away. The warning hung in the air, a cold promise of a future that would never be truly peaceful. But as Eli climbed into the wagon and took the reins, with Helena on one side and Clara on the other, he did not feel fear. He felt the solid, warm presence of his family beside him. They would face the world together. The ride back to the ranch was long and quiet. The dust of South Pass settled on their clothes, and the sheriff's final, Bitter warning seemed to hang in the air behind them. But it was a different kind of quiet than the ones that had come before. It was not the silence of tension or fear, but of gravity, a deep, shared understanding of what they had faced and what they had become. They had walked into the lion's den and emerged, not unscathed, but whole. They had declared themselves to the world, and now, in the sanctuary of their own valley, they had to declare themselves to each other. That evening, Eli led them down to the riverbank, to the fallen log where Helena and Clara had forged their own peace. The sun was setting, painting the water in hues of rose and gold. He stood before them, his hat in his hands, his face etched with a sincerity that was more profound than any poem. For a man of few words, he seemed to be wrestling with a mountain of them. "I have not been a good man for most of my life," he began, his voice a low rumble, rough with emotion. "I have lived alone, and I thought that was my sentence, to be solitary, to pay for my past by having no future." He looked at Helena, his gaze full of a respect that went deeper than words. "You taught me that survival is a choice you make every morning. You showed me what strength really is." Then he turned his eyes to Clara, and his expression softened into something tender and fiercely protective. "And you taught me that a man is not the sum of his worst mistakes. You showed me a kindness I did not believe I deserved." He took a deep, shaky breath, the effort of his confession costing him dearly. He looked back and forth between them, his heart bare in his eyes. "I know the world will not give us a name. They will call us sinners. They will call us wrong." He took a step closer, reaching out and taking one of each of their hands. His grip was warm and firm. "So I am asking," he said, his voice thick with a lifetime of unspoken longing. "I am asking you both. Call it marriage. Call it a family. Call it a sin. I do not care what name the world gives it. I only care that we give it to each other, that we make this our own. Will you be my family? Will you let me be yours?" It was not a proposal of law or religion. It was a proposal of the heart, a raw and honest plea to build a new world, right here on this small patch of land. Clara's answer was a sob, a single, crystalline tear that traced a path through the dust on her cheek as she nodded, unable to speak. It was a tear not of sorrow, but of a joy so overwhelming it was painful. Helena's answer was a slow, deliberate smile. It was a rare and beautiful thing, a smile that had weathered 100 storms and finally found a reason to break through the clouds. She squeezed his hand, her answer as clear and strong as she was. And Eli, feeling their acceptance flow into him, finally exhaled. It was a breath he felt he had been holding for 20 years, a great shuddering release of solitude, guilt, and fear. He stood there on the riverbank, holding the hands of his 2 women, his 2 partners, his family, and for the first time in his life, he felt the unmistakable peace of being truly home. The next spring, they did not rebuild the burned half of the barn. Instead, they tilled the ashen soil and planted wildflowers, poppies and lupine and Indian paintbrush. It was Clara's idea. Something beautiful should grow where something was lost, she had said. Helena had only grunted in response, but she was the first one on her knees, working the seeds into the dark, fertile earth. That summer, Eli raised a new sign over the cabin door. He had carved it himself from a single piece of pine, the letters deep and sure. It did not say shepherd. It said, "Shepherd's Rest." It was a declaration to any who passed, and a promise to themselves. This was their sanctuary. This was where the running stopped. The years passed, flowing into one another like the seasons. They did not erase the scars, but they weathered them, softened their edges. Time worked its slow magic on them. Clara's hair, once the color of pale straw, turned to spun gold in the relentless summer sun. She grew into her strength, her movements becoming as sure and confident as Helena's, though she never lost the gentle song in her voice. Helena began to laugh more. The sound, at first, was like a dry branch cracking, startling and unused. But over time, it became a rich, throaty chuckle that was often the warmest sound in the cabin. She still carried her rifle, but she held it less like a shield and more like a familiar tool. And Eli grew older. Gray threaded his beard, and deeper lines etched their way around his eyes. But he grew stronger, too. The weight he had carried on his shoulders for so long was gone, replaced by the steady, comforting presence of the two women who flanked him. He was no longer a solitary peak, but the central mountain in a range of three, each drawing strength from the others. Their life was a quiet tapestry woven from hard work and simple peace. The rumors in town faded into legend, the story of the strange family in the basin becoming just another local tale. They were left alone, their isolation becoming their greatest protection. One night, in the deep cold of their 5th winter together, a ghost from the old world came riding in. He was a stooped, skinny man on a sway-backed horse, his face illuminated by the light from the cabin window. He was drunk and desperate, and the bottle in his hand was nearly empty. He reined his horse to a sloppy halt in the yard and stared at the cabin as if it were a mirage. Eli stepped out onto the porch, flanked instantly by Helena and Clara. The stranger's eyes, bleary and unfocused, widened as he looked at Eli. A slow, rotten smile spread across his face. "I will be," the man slurred, pointing a shaky finger. "Eli Shepherd. I knew it was you. I saw you in town once, years ago. I remember the face, from the poster." Clara's breath hitched, the poster she had torn down all those years ago. "You have got the wrong man," Eli said, his voice flat and cold. "Ride on." No, I ain't wrong," the bounty hunter insisted, his greed making him bold. "There was $100 on that poster, an old bounty, but some of 'em are still good. $100. He looked from Eli to the two women, a new, uglier thought entering his mind. He swung his leg over the horse, his movements clumsy. "I reckon I will take the money, and maybe a little extra for my trouble." "This is your only warning," Eli said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "Get back on your horse and leave my property." The man laughed, a wet, gurgling sound. He was a relic, a man who still believed the world worked by the old rules of fear and brute force. He did not understand that he had not stumbled upon a lone man's cabin. He had stumbled upon a fortress. "I ain't scared of you. Shepherd!" he snarled, and his hand moved, a blur of drunken overconfidence, toward the pistol on his hip. He never cleared the leather. There were two reports. So close together they sounded almost as one. The first was the sharp crack of Helena's rifle. The second was the deeper boom of the shotgun in Clara's hands. The bounty hunter was thrown backward as if struck by an invisible fist, a look of profound surprise on his face. He hit the frozen ground and did not move again. A profound silence fell over the yard, broken only by the nervous whinny of the man's horse. The smell of gunpowder was sharp and clean in the cold night air. Eli had not even drawn his weapon. He looked at Helena, her face calm and resolute behind the rifle sight. He looked at Clara, who stood her ground. The heavy shotgun held steady, her expression not of fear, but of fierce, unwavering resolve. They had not waited for him to protect them. They had protected what was theirs. The next morning, under a gray and unforgiving sky, they buried the man on the ridge behind the cabin. There was already one grave there, a simple wooden cross that marked the final resting place of John Miller, Helena's husband. They dug a second hole in the hard, cold earth beside it. They did not say a prayer. They did not speak his name. They simply returned him to the dirt, as Eli threw the last shovelful of earth onto the unmarked grave. Clara looked from the new mound to the old one. "All the past goes here," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was a final benediction, a closing of the book. All the ghosts, the abusive husband, the shame-filled past, the bounty on a man's head were now buried, side by side, on the cold, wind-swept ridge. In the final scene, years later, the three of them sat on the porch of the cabin, A gentle rain was falling, a soft, persistent drumming on the roof that washed the world clean. The wild flowers they had planted on the barn's grave had spread, a riot of color that tumbled down the small slope. The sign Eli had carved, Shepherd's Rest, was weathered now, the letters softened by sun and snow. They were older. The gray in Eli's beard was now a soft white. The lines on Helena's face told a story of a life lived, not just endured, and Clara's golden hair was woven with strands of silver. They sat in a comfortable, familiar silence. Eli leaned back in his chair, his eyes on the misty horizon, a quiet sentinel watching over his world. Helena sat on the top step, and she leaned back, resting her head in Clara's lap. Clara's hand came down to stroke Helena's hair, her movements slow and tender, a gesture of such profound and simple love it needed no words. They had made it, through the fire of a burning wagon and the ice of a winter blizzard, through the shame of a preacher's condemnation and the judgment of a hostile town, through the raw desire that had first broken them open and the quiet love that had healed them, through the threat of the law and the final, dying echo of death itself. They had faced it all, and they were still here. They were not alone anymore. The light began to fade, the gray of the rain-soaked afternoon deepening into the soft purple of twilight. Just before the last light was gone, Helena, her eyes closed, her head still resting in Clara's lap, whispered the words into the falling rain, a final truth for only them to hear. "He held us both, until dawn." Thank you for being part of our story tonight. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. And do not forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.